All right, good afternoon. My name is Martha Cole. I'm a historical specialist here at the Montana Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the fourth in our series of Montana history in 9 easy lessons. If you missed any of the first 3, you can watch them on YouTube. There's a link to that from our website. This is also going to be recorded to watch if a friend of yours couldn't make it and wants to talk about it with you. Next week, our topic will be disintegration, Montana's tribal nations in the early reservation years through the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, and that will be presented by Laura Ferguson. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll just ask if there are teachers here who want to receive OPI renewal units. I have forms, so see me afterwards. And if you already have a form, just have me or another staff member sign your form. And that's what you'll need to do to receive your renewal unit. So our topic today is industrial Montana. And I'm just delighted that Paula Petrik agreed to present on this for us. She's Professor Emeritus from George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, retired to Helena. She received her PhD from SUNY-Binghamton and an MFA from the University of Montana. She's the author of No Step Backward, Women and Family on the Rocky Mountain Mining Frontier, and co-editor with Elliott West of Small Worlds, Children and Adolescents in America, 1850 to 1950, as well as the author of several articles. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paula.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank Martha for that fine introduction. Today I'm going to talk about several topics. It's tough to squeeze them all in, but we'll try. This is a quick trip through the economic history of Montana. Now, when we talk about industrialization, there were 2 industrialization periods in U.S. history. The first one took place on the East Coast, mostly textiles manufacture in Massachusetts. We probably all learned this in the 6th grade. But there was a second one. It's called the Heavy Industrial Revolution. And that's when companies began to really capitalize on using steam and later on the internal combustion engine. So we're talking about heavy industry when we talk about industrialization in the second period. And that pertains to Montana. Now, we're not talking about the potato chip factory in Missoula or the biscuit factory in Helena. We're talking primarily, this is probably a Butte story. What? More than anything else. All right, so keep that in mind, heavy industry. Now, if we plot on a map sites of heavy industry, you're beginning to see it already, aren't you? DOD contractors, high-end retail, we'll notice something. Now, if we draw a triangle and we go across our northern border, and North Dakota is included in here. I'm not sure what they do in North Dakota, but I'm sure it's important. We can even see this more clearly now. And for whatever reason, and we'll explore that today, Montana, this area in the United States, has none of what we'd call heavy industry right now. Even the copper mine in Butte, copper mining in Butte right now is not classified as that. That, of course, is using a more modern classification. But the question then becomes, what happened? Why is this the case? Because it's very important. It says something about why perhaps Montana does not have a sales tax and an income tax instead. There are a whole raft load of questions we could ask about why Montana, that part of North Dakota, et cetera, does not have heavy industry, while the rest of the nation pretty much does. I think there's a small area in northern Alabama that doesn't have any either, but we won't compare ourselves to Alabama. Okay. So that wasn't always the case. Now, we're going to step back a little bit here. In the beginning, after the gold rush, we had silver mining. Now let's for a moment sort of step back even a little bit further. When Montana sort of came into being as a territory, there were high hopes. In fact, in the New York Times, Montana would advertise, come to Montana, build your factory here, and they would tout all the advantages one would have in putting a plant or some kind of heavy industry in Montana, or any industry at all, to be honest. This was especially prevalent in the 1880s, right? Montana advertised in the New York Times, all the household periodicals, and it was very optimistic, very optimistic. By 1900, those advertisements had vanished. Instead, articles appeared in various publications like Inside the Mind of the Montana Brown Trout. Battling the Chinook Salmon. What had happened between inviting all the industry to Montana and then contemplating the mind of a Montana brown trout? Now, I know there are people who think that's very important, so, but the whole mindset of Montana had changed from industry to tourism. Okay. Why had that happened? Well, let's take a step forward and talk about silver mining, because this is really where our story begins, right? Silver mining requires heavy fixed capital cost, things like stamp mills and whatnot. Silver mining began in Montana roughly about 1878, around Phillipsburg with the bimetallic and the Granite Mountain mines, okay? It required a heavy investment in works and whatnot. And that was because silver is an amalgam. Unlike gold, it doesn't appear free. It has to be smelted to bring the silver out. And then, of course, you have to get rid of the mercury that was part of the amalgamation, the smelting process. And to do this, you needed to build a good deal of stuff. This is an early mine in Cable, Montana, but you could already see that unlike placer mining, which you did in a long tom, a sluice box, or using your thighs sitting in a stream with a pan, this is much more complicated. And it very quickly becomes even more complicated, okay? This is a Comet mine, it still exists, you can go and see it. And you can see already that the works has become much more complex. They're using gravity a lot here to move the silver, and what they're doing essentially is crushing it. This particular mine did not have smelting works, so they are crushing the ore in order to send it off, okay? Where did they send it? Okay. In the early days, they had to send it all the way to Wales to be reduced, okay? So wagon loads of this crushed rock went to the nearest railroad, which during the 1870s, the Utah Railroad ended about in Dillon. So it was a good trip, a good long trip to move this crushed rock to Dillon, get it on the Utah Railroad, get it to the Union Pacific Railroad, send it to the east, put it on a ship, and then send it to Wales to be reduced. They would also do that with copper in the early days too. but it began here with silver. Now, in addition to the infrastructure required for silver mining, it soon became clear with all this moving ore to Wales that that was not a profit-making endeavor. So there was always pressure to get a railroad into Montana. And with silver, the possibility of silver and its profits, investors in the East saw a possibility. And so they were the sort of impetus behind getting a railroad into Montana. And they had enough money to do it. The first round with Jay Cooke ended badly. Anything that Jay Cooke touched seemed to end badly. Except for his last project, which was good for Montana. But he was like a cat with 9 lives. He always recovered from his latest financial disaster. So the railroad became extremely important, and investors saw now that there was a reason to really build one in Montana, because there wasn't a reason before. Why build it into a place where there are no people? Okay? So now there was a reason. Okay, the first railroad, as I said, was the Utah and Northern, okay? And it came up to Dillon. It was a narrow gauge railroad. In other words, it didn't fit into the standard gauge, but it got things and whatnot from around Dillon south to Corinne, Utah, which is where it hooked up with the Union Pacific. It was a 7-day stage ride or wagon ride to Dillon, and then loading up in these very small narrow gauge cars to go to Corinne. Okay, now the Northern Pacific Railroad soon followed, and the story of the Northern Pacific Railroad is a complex one. It makes it to Bismarck by 1876. Earlier in 1873, it had declared bankruptcies, one of 3 that the Northern Pacific would endure. And in 1876, of course, it carries the news of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Okay? And we can see here, it enters Montana about near Webo. Kind of has a little jump up to Glendive, which is its first railroaders, correct me if I'm wrong, section point in Montana. Goes down to Miles City, Billings. Oh, by the way, when I was doing this, putting the presentation together, I was thinking, I rode on trains. And I was thinking, how many people in the audience will have ridden on a train? How many people? Yay! Yeah. I thought, there's someone as old as I am in the audience. Okay? Went down through here, and here was an interesting thing. It split here, Livingston, which was a big shop for the Northern Pacific. The northern route went up to Helena, southern through Butte, and then on out to the Puget Sound. It arrived in Butte on the day after Christmas in 1881. By June of that year, it was in Helena and on out. So pretty much the state was covered. It just had a little bit there left to do. The Golden Spike was ceremony took place in the summer of 1883, and Frederick Billings had a great party. And of course, then the Northern Pacific declared its bankruptcy again. We're lucky to have it. Now, so finally the railroad comes. There is a reason for it to come. Of course, at this time also, there's another development nationally. And big investors, who are always on the lookout for the next big thing, see it as extremely important. And that is Thomas Edison's electric light. And Thomas Edison's electric light will require copper, and lots of it. And Butte, Montana had copper, and lots of it. So now there is a second very large reason to invest in Montana. Okay. Now, the problem becomes then, where does the money come from? Okay. This is a huge investment project. This is not a small thing. At this point, the sources of capital are in Helena. But the project is too big for the banks in Helena. At this time, Helena had 6 banks, 4 of them national banks. It was richer than Denver in terms of its capitalization, but even then, it could not handle the risk associated with railroad building. It will soon become clear that it can't handle the risk of building the infrastructure in Butte. And certainly Daley and Clark, W.A. Clark and Marcus Daley realized this, and they go east and west for the sources of their capital. Because once again, we're going to require lots. Now, along with the railroad comes immigration. The Northern Pacific, for example, opened offices in Norway and in Germany, recruiting people, settlers, to come to Montana. And it was a good time to do this because Europe was in an uproar and people wanted to get out. For example, my ancestors, there were 12 when they started out from what is now Czechoslovakia, be Bohemia then. 12 boys, and the 1 girl would be born on the island in New York City. And they came because of the 12 boys. They didn't want to be drafted. You know. So I come from an honorable family of draft dodgers. But they were just not going to get into what was going on. I looked at their, now with the internet you can see everything, and I looked at the town they came from, a place called Cherbenice. I would leave Cherbenice, really. I mean, it looked like a horrible place. I'd jump on that, sign up, and go right away. Okay. Now, immigration, of course, there are 2 streams. One is the agricultural stream. What these railroads want are good farmers, stalwart, good farmers. And they want them in places where no people live, so they can build towns and sell lots in these towns and sell sections. Now, there's probably someone in this room who comes from a family that bought a farm or a ranch from the original Northern Pacific or Great Northern Land Grant. This is how the railroads made their money and paid off their debts, is selling. For example, the NP owned every other section in eastern Montana. So this is how they made their money, and barring the bankruptcies, which seemed to overtake them because of bad management, they made a lot of money. And this attracted the farmers. The second stream came because they had heard about the good wages paid in mining. Never mind that many of them knew nothing about mining. When they heard $5 a day, they were on a train. And folklore has it that sometimes they really didn't know where they were going, and so someone who knew where they landed in New York City or in New Orleans and whatnot would pin a picture on the jacket of the 7 stacks of the Never Sweat mine. And conductors along the way would know to say, keep going, until they got to Butte, where they would say, stop, this is it, this is the place. So you have these 2 streams, the industrial stream, the agricultural stream. And of course, the industrial stream heads immediately for Butte, because they see the good wages. As I said, many of them did not know anything about mining, and the coroner's inquests in Silver Bow County attest to that. Some of them are pretty grisly to read. One of them is before safety regulations required it, the cages had no sides. And what you would do is you'd hold onto a bar on top and then drop down the shaft. You would go from maybe 30 below on the surface to maybe 96 degrees below, okay? And you're going at a pretty good clip down there. People, of course, would get dizzy, and they'd reach out to steady themselves, except the wall was a moving target. And several of them were sucked between the wall and the cage, which I can't imagine what that would do, but, and it happened quite often. And sometimes they would be warned, but so many languages were spoken that they oftentimes didn't understand. And most of the shift bosses were Cornish and spoke English. And that was probably the least of the number of languages. Now, if we saw that silver mining required a huge infrastructure, copper mining in Butte required even more. This is the Gallus hoist at the Seward mine in Butte. And you can see already we have a hoist, we have a hoist house back there. You can't see it, but there would be a cable running back to the hoist house. You can see the tracks for a narrow gauge tramway that would take the ore out to the main train, which would, in later days, take the ore over to Anaconda to the smelter, or as they say, Anaconda in eastern Montana. Okay. Now it even gets more elaborate. This is the famous 7 stacks of the Never Sweat mine, and you can see already what's necessary. This is the mine's own rail line. Has smelting facilities. Inside this sort of long building here are big compressors that are sending air down. You could see a double hoist there. The Never Sweat was a big operation. And here's the hoist house here. The cable runs in there. And there are a complex series of bells and whatnot that make sense to the miners about things that are happening underground if someone needs to come up or down, if there's a medical emergency, an accident, if someone needs to move material, if they're doing blasting. The hoist house will be put into action and people will move up and down the shafts. Shafts in Butte were very deep. For those of us who saw in the early days the pit before it filled with water, it's pretty deep. And that was the deepest it went. If you sort of think about an inverted Christmas tree, okay, that's how the mines looked going down into the pit. They all went off like little branches from this Christmas tree type of affair. Okay, so we have this huge investment, and the investors are from the East, and that's going to be important because they will pull out when the going gets tough. And we'll see that again. Okay, now let's get back to the amount of money that is required for Butte. These are custom-built hoist motors. They are huge. A 6-foot man, they're roughly 14 feet high, and they handle, this is a real modern one, probably 1939, 1935, and double hoist in the hoist room here. And you can see over here, this is where the hoist man stood, and there, the round thing up there, which looks like a beach ball, is the call signals. And he's got them all memorized and whatnot, and we'll read them. He is an incredibly important man. A wrong hoist call can cause all sorts of problems. But all custom made. If you go to the Steward Mine, how many have been to the Steward Mine in Butte? Taken a look at it. oh, go. It's really great. If you like machines, it's wonderful. There are these two big blue generators. They're as big as this part of the room here. And they were custom built for Anaconda by General Electric. And it's got the little Anaconda arrowhead on it. And they are huge. And you would think about the money that went into those big generators. It's just amazing. So go and see those. I heartily recommend them. But you kind of got to be interested in machines, you know. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. Okay. Early on in Butte, blasting was done by doing something called single and double jacking. And what this was essentially was a drill bit, and single jacking was taking one hammer and pounding it in, making a hole in the stope, which was the front of the, where they were expanding the mine or following a vein. And double jacking was, there would be a young bit holder who would hold the bit, and then there would be two guys with big sledgehammers pounding alternatively on this bit. And if they missed, someone wouldn't have a hand. They were huge. And then the blast, the powder would be pounded in, the blasting caps, and then hopefully everyone would step back, and then they would count to hear the number of blasts. And if they didn't hear one, someone had to go back and check to see what went wrong. And there are a number of coroner's inquests that point to the fact that sometimes they got it wrong. Okay. Now, later on, though, these two items were created, which made that job a lot easier. The Ingersoll Rand drill and the Burley drill. These are not things that you tuck in your pocket. You can see the Ingersoll Rand here has wheels wheeled into the tunnel and then up against the wall. You can see it's kind of drilling a hole there. This is the Burley drill. It was much more powerful than the Ingersoll. This was steam-powered, of all things, and this, of course, was a pneumatic drill. The problems with both of these is that they produced a lot of dust, and a lot of copper mining was done in heavy silica, grounded rock. And the silica would be breathed into the lungs, and this would be turned into, if a man worked long years underground, into something called miner's con, miner's consumption. And what would happen is the little sharp silicas would literally shred the lungs. This was a dangerous business. You had the cage, you had missed blasts, you had silica. And then you had simple accidents like this drill falling on people. The Burley drill was quite heavy. Mostly it would be put on a tripod and manned by two men, one who would sort of steer the drill and the other one who would operate it. But you can see how complex this is becoming from this sort of simple thing to this thing that looks like it came from outer space. Now, here we can see the combination of the, this is Martha's favorite slide. It's this is the no smoking, and it's in 16 languages. You have Greek, okay, Italian, French. French is right down here at the bottom. Obviously, not many people spoke French, but there were a few. Spanish, so you can see the number and kinds of people who were there. Serbian, a large population of Serbs in Butte. But it shows the combination of immigration and industrialization and urbanization that Butte's population swelled. I'm not sure it's as big as many of the books say, as 100,000, because I really don't think they all would fit. If you count the number of houses, even boarding houses, and the number of people, several thousand people would be living in tents, but that's never been reported, so I'm thinking that it's a little bit less. But still, the population went from a couple thousand up to 60,000. People lived right near the mines. must have been terribly noisy. And there are reports of people saying at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the visibility was so bad from the smoke that you couldn't see the street lights. You would have to turn on the street lights so people could see to cross the street and not be hit by wagons. Okay. Now, let's go to Helena, because here's where the original sources of capital were, okay? And the first bank, now you have to think, you know, what's going to happen here, okay? Why can't Montana capitalize its own industries? They could have done a small mine, but they couldn't have probably done Butte. That needed outside. So S.T. Hauser, we have any number of things that are named after S.T. Hauser. I'm here first to tell you that he was nothing more than a white-collar criminal. President of the First National Bank. He had all his relatives in the bank, too. What he would do was he would have his relatives get loans from the bank, and then they would take a cut, and then they would kick it back to him. And this was a way he financed a lot of his projects. The interesting thing about S.T. Hauser, he always managed to have someone else take the rap for any kind of failure in a business. As a bank examiner once said, S.T. Hauser is more popular than competent at running a bank. He added that the records are in disarray. He does not know who he has accommodated, co-signed for, or what loans are in his own name. So the First National Bank was chaotic from the beginning. And S.T. Hauser was right in there. Okay? And chiefly, that's how he made his money. He went through several cashiers. His brother-in-law was the cashier, and he made sure he had his thumb on the cashier. Cashier was married to Hauser's sister. In the beginning, he was very worried about the bank and his position in the bank, but he had 6 children, and he wanted to educate them. And he soon discovered that being close to Hauser gave him a lot of money. But in the beginning, it caused him a lot of moral angst. That didn't last too long. So there we have. Okay. Now, the First National Bank was the smallest in terms of physical plant, but it's the only one that still exists, right? You all been by the securities building? This was the First National Bank. And if you look at the carving right here, it will tell you, we'll say it was the First National Bank and when it was built. I think in 1935 it lost its good cupola, which I would like to see come back. Sort of looks like a guillotine has got after the securities building. But this was Hauser's headquarters. When he was governor, you can see there's a kind of a little door in the back there. He built an annex onto the bank so that the government of Montana and the bank were in the same building. He wasn't governor for long, and that's an interesting question in Montana history. He had wanted to be governor for so long, he gets to be governor, and 17 months later he resigns. I've often wondered why that happened. Why he resigned from something that he had wanted all his career. Interesting question. You wonder, maybe someone had something on him. Okay, we have the Merchants National Bank. Maybe some of you remember the Merchants National Bank? No one remembers that? Yes, okay. It fell victim, I think, to the urban renewal, but it was run by C.A. Broadwater. C.A. Broadwater was president of the Montana National Bank. Unfortunately, he died in 1892 of pneumonia. Things might have been different had Charlie Broadwater lived. He was a very honest person, and maybe some of the hijinks that the other banks got up to wouldn't have happened. Okay. T.A. Marlowe followed him. He was not as honest and upright as Charlie Broadwater. There's a situation where he tried to buy bonds in one of the few going businesses in Helena. He wanted to get them at a song, but E.T. Wilson, the receiver of the other banks, really played his game close to the chest and bested him. T.A. Marlowe never forgot that. In fact, he walked over to E.T. Wilson and told him that he would get him someday. Not a nice person. Okay, here's the Montana National Bank. How many of you are familiar with the Lewis and Clark Library? In the Buffalo? Yeah. The Buffalo used to be right here. Right there. When Charlie Broadwater founded the bank, one of his friends told him that the bank would last as long as there were buffalo. No, there'd be buffalo in the streets of Helena before that bank existed or was built. And so Charlie Broadwater wanted to commemorate that, and so he put the buffalo right above the front door. The bank burned in 1943, and I think 4 people lost their lives. In the 30s and early 40s, there were a lot of fires in Helena, mysteriously enough, and this was one of them. Now, the Second National Bank was run by Erastus D. Edgerton of the amazing comb-over. What was he thinking? I don't know. Interestingly enough, though, he was the one honest person in the whole banking fraternity. He was also left holding the bag at the very end, and probably contributed to his early death. But he was the manager of the smallest bank. In July 1893, however, 2 of the major banks closed. The Montana National and the First National Bank closed their doors. Over in the Merchants Bank, it was pretty scary. By the end of the day, Hirschfield, I have a picture of Hirschfield someplace. The Hirschfields were down to their last $10,000 as people made a run on the bank. But they were steely-eyed and managed to make it through. E.D. Edgerton also stood at the helm and managed to make it through the panic. Right? But the failure of these 2 banks really rattled investors and depositors. When the depositors came back, they wanted to express confidence in the bank. Sometimes banking is like done with smoke and mirrors. And if people believe in the bank, it will withstand a lot. If they don't believe in the bank, it will go down over the cliff. So both Edgerton and the Hirschfields stood strong, and the Helena National Bank also did. The Helena National Bank, though, was betrayed by its president, who went out and assigned his property. We don't do that much anymore, assignment. Assignment is simply that you go to a friend and say, here are all my debts and all my assets, figure it out. So that my debts are paid, etc. Shirley Ashby was his name. He was extraordinarily clever. He would write checks to people who, write loans to people who had no chance of paying them back. One was a stable guy, worked in the stables a few blocks from the bank in the Helena National. The other one was so upset when he discovered that he'd done this sort of bogus loan that he committed suicide. When Edgerton went to ask Ashby to pay up because he owed his bank, Ashby said, Erastus, you're taking this entirely too seriously. and Edgerton is just amazed by this. He's so taken aback that he's speechless. Nothing like this has ever happened to him. So he goes back and he makes a decision then that he is going to sue Ashby in federal court. He loses because Ashby lies like a rug and owns, is part of the old group. Ashby will land on his feet after a little punishment period. Edgerton won't, though. Edgerton, in the end, becomes president as these banks consolidate, president of the First National Bank. He does everything right, clears the ledgers, does everything right. And he goes now to collect these debts. And there are people who can pay. It's not that A.J. Seligman of the Seligmans in New York cannot come up with $20,000. And they basically blow him off too. And in the end, he's connected with the Butte Bank, and the Butte Bank lets him down. And that's the end of the First National. But to the very end, even with the receiver, he is extraordinarily straightforward and honest. Probably does him in. This is something you rarely see. This is my favorite slide. This is the closure notice that someone had the good sense to save from the closure of the Merchants National Bank. The Merchants was able to stave off everyone until 1897. And just before Valentine's Day in 1897, it was forced to close. And this was primarily because of the Aaron Hirschfield's very messy divorce. He had been involved with this nice young girl. He was 20 years older than she was. But Aaron is kind of a character that you kind of feel for as a historian. He's 40 years old. He kind of turns around. His brother has a family, has all this, and he's been a dog's body. His brother, L.H. Lewis Hirschfield, goes off to New York, does all these things, and there's Aaron working in the bank. It's 30 below zero in a Montana winter. He never gets to go any place but for 2 weeks. Lewis is gone for months at a time, leaving the bank, and Aaron, I think, turned around and said, "What have I got?" And so this young woman really likes him, and they decide to get married. Well, they did a little bit before they got married too. But, and they go to Chicago and go to the World's Fair and are married in Chicago. Okay. L.H.'s wife, Mary, is a force to be reckoned with. One observer said, Mary Hirschfield wore the pants in that family. At one point, there's a guy, she doesn't want to see her daughter. It's during the winter here. She goes up 6th Avenue in her sleigh, and she corners the guy in the vestibule of the Diamond Block, gets out her horsewhip, and beats him senseless. Jumps back in her sleigh. Well, I should tell you also, her pistol initially didn't work. That's why she had to use the horsewhip. Jumps in her sleigh, and it sounds like, "Hi-ho, Silver, away!" And she, takes off. So she basically tells Aaron, "Get rid of that woman. I don't want her in the bank." Should say, the Hirschfields are Jewish, and Dell is Roman Catholic. But that didn't seem to bother them. It bothers Mary Hirschfield. And Aaron is not a strong personality, and he caves. And when he caves, it's vicious. And what the Hirschfields do is they put together conspiracy. Aaron goes off to Fargo, which was a divorce mill at this time period, 1895. And they concoct this whole conspiracy that she's having sexual relations with these people in Chicago, and they have these sort of lowlifes come in and testify. But there's one young man who is kind of worried about this whole process. And he goes to C.B. Nolan, her attorney, and he blows the whole thing up. And C.B. Nolan is a good attorney. And so these lowlifes get on the stand in Fargo in this divorce case. You battled it out in court when you divorced. He tears them to pieces, okay? And the judge is furious. Because, well, Aaron had asked not for a divorce, but for an annulment, because that would prevent inheritance and all this kind of stuff. The judge just will not grant the annulment. So the whole thing comes back here to Helena. And C.B. Nolan suggests to Dell that she sue Mr. and Mrs. Hirschfield for alienation of affection. That was an old thing. We don't do that anymore. You just kind of break up, and that's it. And she wins. They pay her $30,000. Multiply that by 27, and you get what it would be in current dollars. And then the Hirschfields come back, and they put what is known as a card in the Helena Independent. And basically it says, well, we thought you would understand about this whole process and everything, that, you know, that we care about this and next. I'm thinking, what did the Hirschfields hope that the citizens of Helena would understand? That conspiracies are a good deal? You might want to try one. That it's okay to totally try to destroy a young woman's reputation? It's not exactly clear, but it's terribly messy, and the people of Helena turn against the Merchants National. It's what I call or argue is there are certain sort of theories in economics about what causes runs on banks. And this is what I call a social shock. It doesn't need to be an economic shock, but things like this can affect a bank's history. Well, what happens at the end of this? 50% of the banks in Helena fail. 50%. They're national banks. All that's left are the American National Bank, Tommy Cruise's Workmen's Savings Bank, and the Union Trust from Virginia City absorbs the Merchants National, such as it is, and it becomes the Union Trust, which probably several of you remember was down here. Okay. Now, Helena is not the only place where banks fail. 50% of the banks fail, national banks fail across the state. So capital in Montana is wholly impaired. I don't think you could invest in a used car lot at that point. And what does the state do? Well, first of all, the feds do something. They authorized in 1913 the Federal Banking Act of the National Banking Act of 1913. And Montanans glom onto that. They found 131 new banks in Montana. Anyone know where Edgar is? Edgar? Edgar had a national bank. Yes. Small Edgar had a national bank. Okay? They're all pretty much in the eastern part of the state, although there are several in the western part of the state. Now, Montana also gets into the act and legislates banking and puts together a state banking system where anyone with $20,000 can put together a bank, whether they know anything about banking or not. This is not a good idea. No, no. Especially, of course, during the First World War. And I will say, in one of the forthcoming lectures on homesteading, Professor Swartout will go into this in more detail. But with the state response, they legislate all these little banks. So now you have 131 national banks and a bazillion of these little state banks, which no one knows how to run. During the First World War, weather was good in Montana, especially eastern Montana. Then came the 20s. Okay, commodity prices tank. Everything that could go wrong goes wrong. And these state banks fail left and right. left and right. And I would like to be able to tell you the rest of the story, but the governor's office took away my record, so I'll just have to imagine the rest, I guess. I'm not kidding. So at the end of this, you get this. Some of these have been turned into drugstores. The most popular way to rehabilitate some of these derelict banks is turn them into, you guessed it, a bar. Okay? But they were pretty buildings. They were nice. Now, someone, of course, has taken the lower floor here, and okay. This is the 2-dot State Bank. And that, marvelous plans, because there's a mercantile or some store that was built onto it. So the people who put the State Bank together were kind of hedging their bets there. The bank fails, we still got the store. In the end, of course, they had neither. So endings. With all this bank failure and whatnot, we come down to, in the end, we have Butte. One historian has described as an island completely surrounded by land. It is the only industry and the only community in Helena, in Montana, at the end of the 1930s, or even at the 1920s, that has any economic vitality. Everything else is pretty much hanging on to the ropes. You sort of have the 1-2 punch. You have the failure of banks in the 1890s, followed by the failures in the 1920s. And just when Montana catches its breath, you have the Great Depression, which wipes out more banks. Remember the Montana National Bank? Finally dies in 1936. Takes them a while. And what happens is all those old debts that they've been carrying on their books, some from 1893, finally catch up with them. Where does Montana turn? It turns to the only thing that's left, its landscape. And so begins Montana's tourist industry, which is not capital intensive. Thank you. That wasn't too boring, was it?
And Paula left just a few minutes for questions that, for the people in the lobby and who are watching online. I'm going to repeat your question.